Hi, everybody. You just finished a unit that covered the World Wars, the 1920s, and the Great Depression, and we are moving right into just briefly covering the event that occurred after those World Wars, especially after World War II. After the United States dropped two atomic weapons on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, Japan, we almost instantly entered a different kind of war. We finished World War II, but we entered a different kind of war called a Cold War. And I'm going to just briefly, read some summaries over this time period. And you will follow on the next page by completing this graphic organizer summary and answering each of these questions that are on this page. So I'm going to go back and begin with some vocabulary that you should be familiar with as I go through this. The United Nations is an organization of nations that work toward peace. Communism is a political and economic system in which the government owns all businesses and land. Cold War. The struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union and their different ways of life. Iron Curtain. The line that divided Europe into communist and non-communist countries. Korean War. The war between communist North Korea and non-communist South Korea. Cuban Missile Crisis. The discovery that the Soviet Union had nuclear missiles in Cuba. Arms race, a race between nations to build powerful weapons. A new kind of war. In 1945, 50 nations met to form the United Nations. Its goal was to find peaceful solutions to international problems. The two most powerful nations, the United States and the Soviet Union, joined the United Nations. The Soviet Union had communism. The United States believed in a democratic government and free enterprise. American leaders wanted to stop the spread of communism. The two nations entered into the Cold War. Now, the Cold War, just a brief aside, is essentially a war in which there is not active fighting going on like we see in World War II and World War I and wars like that. A Cold War means that it's more a war of words and threats and intimidation and building up of massive weapons, especially of mass destruction like atomic weapons, but they aren't necessarily battling one another on a battlefield. There are instances, though, where the Cold War does turn hot, so to speak, and a hot war is just kind of like what I said, a war, when you're actually fighting on the battlefield, like World War I and II. There are instances where the Cold War turns hot, and that's in Korea and Vietnam, when we go to war in those countries. All right, continuing on, the Iron Curtain falls. The Soviet Union controlled Eastern Europe. Under Soviet rule, each nation was ordered to set up a communist government that was loyal to the Soviet Union. The dividing line separating communist and non-communist countries in Europe was called the Iron Curtain. President Truman worked to strengthen the non-communist nations of Western Europe. Now, the Iron Curtain was not an actual curtain. It was more, although a fence of some sort likely was built along that area, along that line, so to speak, that imaginary line. But for the most part, it was an imaginary line that if you were in a non-communist country, you were not allowed to cross over into a communist country. And it does extend over quite a bit from northern Europe to southern Europe, dividing the Eastern Europe from Western Europe. And although there was fences that probably stretched that whole distance, because that's quite a long distance, there was not an actual iron curtain or an iron wall. All right, Cold War conflicts. After World War II ended, Korea was divided into North Korea and South Korea. With the Soviet Union's help, North Korea set up a communist government. On June 25, 1950, North Korean forces invaded South Korea. President Truman wanted to help stop the spread of communism. He sent American troops into South Korea. The Korean War had begun. The Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1959, Cuba became the first communist country in the Western Hemisphere. In 1962, the United States discovered that the Soviets were setting up nuclear missiles in Cuba. This became known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. President John F. Kennedy told the American people about the crisis. Then he demanded that the Soviet Union remove their missiles. He said that the U.S. Navy would block Soviet ships from bringing more nuclear weapons into Cuba. The arms race continues. The United States and the Soviet Union continued their arms race. They raced to build stronger and more dangerous weapons. U.S. leaders thought it was important to stay ahead of the Soviets. They believed that if the United States had stronger weapons than the Soviets would not attack. So as I mentioned earlier, you'll be coming to this page and simply summarizing what you learned on the previous page. So we talked about the arms race, the Korean War, and the Cuban Missile Crisis, and you will write a brief summary there. For number 2, what differences between the United States and the Soviet Union led to the beginning of the Cold War? Number 3, why did Truman believe the United States should fight in the Korean War? Number 4, what actions did Kennedy take after Soviet missiles were discovered in Cuba? And number 5, critical thinking, express ideas. Do you believe it was important for the United States to stay ahead of the Soviet Union in the arms race? Explain.